Why is there such a huge gap between what we think parenting will be and what it actually is?
The sheer amount of tasks that are demanded of us every day by society has only increased in the past sort of 15, 20 years.
What are the jobs of mums and dads now? What's a dad now he's no longer just a provider? What's a mum now that she often is?
That's where identity comes in terms of what does it mean to be a good woman versus what does it mean to be a good man.
Why, when we think having children will bring us closer together, does it so often push us apart? What am I supposed to teach or model for my children when I have no idea what the world is going to look like in 5 years' time?
One of the most important goals that we can have as parents is just to stand alongside them and sort of let them be the people that they are.
Why did my parents have so much conviction about these things and I have absolutely none? Well, I don't know, but there are some really intelligent people all around the world who've been thinking about this stuff, and they are going to talk to me, and we might not answer all those questions every week, but if we listen to their ideas, maybe we can get some wisdom and some insight and maybe most importantly, some perspective and find out what it takes to be a happier parent. I get to talk to two brilliant people this week. The first is a personal friend. She's a parent-infant psychotherapist. Her name is Benedicta Bywater. She knows me and my family really well, so she's seen firsthand all the many, many bumps that we've hit along our journey. She introduced me to the work of our second guest, the clinical psychologist, Dr. Emma Svanberg. You may know her as the Momologist. She is the author of the brilliant Parenting for Humans. We got to talk about how we can find common ground when two parents might think their child needs very, very different styles of parenting. We also talk about dads and the fact that we bring something really different to parenting, and we can often find it quite hard to be reflective about the parenting we've received ourselves. We talk about small t trauma. Are we too worried about traumatizing our kids? It's not an easy answer to that question, but maybe that's why we need podcasts, because the best answers aren't simple. It's a really great conversation. It went off in a direction I really wasn't expecting, and I hope you really enjoy it. The chapter of the book, which for me was the most, is the most relevant for what I'm interested in. We'll talk loads about the book. I thought it was amazing. Was the partners who parent chapter. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask this question: do partners who parent need to share parenting values?
I think sharing values is really important. I think that there might be some differences in terms of how they show up in terms of behaviour or the kind of goals that we might have or the kind of strategies that we might use. But in terms of our sort of ethos, which can often be what we share with our values, I do think it's important that partners are at least on the same sort of page, even if they're not completely aligned. Because once we have that kind of baseline foundation of shared sets of values, or that might become our family values as well, it just means that all of the other stuff becomes a lot easier to talk about. So, for example, if you notice that your co-parent or partner is doing something that you feel is kind of not aligned to the values that you've agreed upon, then you can pull it back to that rather than what we tend to do, which is point out behavioural strategies, and that can often just end up in conflict.
An example which I've had a few times. I've heard of this. You have a mum who's seems really, really keen, basically never to say no to the child. She wants the child to feel safe by giving it everything it wants on demand when it wants, and a father who genuinely believes boundaries make the child feel safe. They're going to make the child feel more resilient. Mm-hmm. And they both feel genuinely that the other parent is doing that child an injustice with their approach. Mm-hmm. Like, it's real, the mum feels absolutely awful when the dad says to the kid, no, that thing you're doing is bad. And the dad's like, you're turning this kid into an entitled monster. How do they start to have this conversation?
Well, I think because it's really important that we differentiate between behaviour and values, because actually what we're talking about there is behaviour, like the kind of strategies or approach that we might have as parents and how that can differ. But underneath that, there might actually be some really crucial shared values. So what is it that we're both aiming for as parents here? And actually, when you start to talk about that as a couple, you'll find very frequently that the overarching values are very similar. So one might be like, for example, if we're talking about that specific example, perhaps for the mother, there's something there about wanting the child to feel nurtured and cared for. For the father, the value might be more around wanting them to feel resilient or independent. But then if you take that a layer down and look at, well, what are the common values? We want our child to be a good person in the world. Or, what is our overarching aim here? And that's where we can find common ground. And often what we tend to do as parents or as partners is that we'll say to the other partner, well, that thing that you're doing is harming my child. And you kind of come in with this like real sort of fight or flight attitude, because often there is something going on for yourself as well in terms of what's being kind of triggered, for want of a better word, the kind of ripples that come up from our own backgrounds that can come up when we're watching our co-parent parenting in a particular way. But actually, when we talk more about our worry about the lessons that are being taught or the things that are being communicated, often that can be a slightly richer place to start having a conversation, a place that feels less conflictful, and also that kind of has this goal of finding a common ground rather than actually you're just getting it wrong, or I think we should be doing it like this. So it becomes more about looking for the commonality rather than focusing on specific strategies or behaviour. But what you're describing is so common, right? Like that happens in households all over the place, is just that sense of being in a bit of a battle about which strategy is the correct one, in inverted commas.
I see you nodding furiously there, Ditta. Do you want to add to Benedicta? Do you want to add to that?
In my experience, it's basically universal that these things come up in some area or another, and it is typically in that way of kind of mum wanting to be more responsive, more permissive, as it were. And I see so many layers to what's behind that. And I agree, Emma, that you're just looking at the behaviour there and kind of pulling back from that and zooming out either to the core values or to what the things are that are the feeding in to those reactions to the behaviours can be a much more conciliatory way of working through it, because actually there's often so much that's shared. And often you find it's a little thing that's sort of snuck in and then just sort of put roots down. And then people often polarize, particularly when you're so fraught and you're exhausted. Those sort of differences can kind of grow. You described the canyon in your book. And I think that's something I really see, that's something that can start as just like a little hairline, but this can kind of pull further apart.
But there is something, isn't there, about how often in couples, like, we don't really talk about those things that are important to us. Not just in terms of raising children, but what are our values? How do we want to live our lives as people in the world? And then when you have children, it becomes so important and so raw. So these things often get talked about at times of high conflict, where you see your partner do something that for some reason you inherently disagree with. We don't often then have the space or the capacity to be able to really talk about what is it that's coming up for us in these moments. And I think the layers, like you were saying, the layers are so important, because actually what is coming up so often is this little kid in us who kind of comes out and goes, no, you can't talk to a kid like that because it makes me feel horrible. And then we're acting from a much younger, more emotional, more reactive part of us, which, means that things can get, very fraught very quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say, and also sometimes because we don't have those big conversations, we assume the answer to that thing is the child.
Right.
It's like what are my values? This child we've made is my values. This is my everything. And it's quite hard to avoid. We live in an age where we don't ask those, because we sort of lack spirituality or religion. We're like, what's my purpose? Oh, it's you. And that's not fair.
On anyone.
On anyone. Yeah.
That's really interesting, Alex. So there's something in what you're saying about how, because we don't have a sort of purpose, like if we, let's say in spirituality, there is this idea of being, having purpose in life, that without that it becomes about the child, like the child becomes our purpose, or the child becomes a kind of demonstration of our achievement or our success. And I think that
identity.
And, we do live in this really sort of individualistic age where I think for a lot of parents, that's absolutely true. The child becomes this kind of product or project. And if the child is responding in a particular way, then we feel like we're good parents. But if for whatever reason they're not responding in that way, then where does that leave us?
That's a really important point, I think.
Sorry, will you just share your analogy about the two maps with the bridge and the troll? Because I think it'd be important for listeners to hear it before we go any further.
Well, the analogy sort of that I use throughout the book is this idea that we all have our own individual map that is made up of lots of different experiences. So both our kind of childhood experiences, which is all the way back from our experiences in the womb, as babies, as small children, and then how that affects us as we grow through our lives, the relationships that we have that might be our early relationships and also our later relationships. Often there are very familiar patterns that we see kind of in our relationships throughout our life. And then we kind of, on our map, we move into our sort of adult self. So thinking about some of the different kind of strategies or masks that we wear as adults, the different ways that we might respond to things. And then there are the kind of people around us. So what's going on around us in terms of what kind of support do we have from our family, from our friends, from other parents, from our community. But then also kind of the map widens out to all of the other things that impact on us as individuals. So what kind of society do we live in? What are our cultural values? What kind of support system is available to us? And then kind of so it goes all the way back to our sort of ancestral history, and then all the way to, kind of the different things that impact us in our kind of current life. And the idea is that we all have these maps, right, that we don't always really look at, we don't always know that they're there. But when we have a child, all of a sudden, those things become much more obvious to us, that we have walked these particular paths that have influenced us throughout our life and will influence us in our parenting decision making. And then we have our partner or co-parent who has their own map. And often when we first become a couple, those maps are kind of side by side. So there might be a little bit of distance between them, but often we find ways. So this is the bridge that I talk about in the book, that we find ways to build bridges between the maps. And often what will happen is one partner might be, a bit more ready to go over the bridge and go onto the other map and kind of go along with that for a little while. Or they might sort of dance around together in the bridge and kind of not really look at the maps at all. But then when you have a child, what often happens is that each of you is very unconsciously saying, no, you have to go on my map. Like, this is my map and this is the way that things are going to work and this is the pathway that I know is defined. Or actually, I've decided to slightly rewrite my map because I've read this great parenting book or I've learned about this strategy. So I've added that onto my map, but come and have a look over here because this is the map that's going to get us, furthest on our journey, or this is the map that we want to follow that's going to mean that we don't get lost. And actually what can happen so often is that we don't talk about this as parents, as partners. So we end up kind of both stuck on our own maps, kind of just like on the different sides of the bridge, going like, you're really far away over there and I don't know what you're doing over there because my map's obviously so much better than yours. Or we can have like actual conflict where the bridge starts to crumble and it becomes really hard to find our way to each other again. And the idea of it really is that by understanding each other's maps and understanding the things that are really important to us and the things that are just unconsciously there in our systems, in the way that we work and the way that we relate to people and the way that we show up in the world, the more that we understand that about each other, the more that we can find those sort of common pathways. And there will be aspects that we let go of on both of our maps in order to be able to kind of build that bridge and bring those maps together. The importance of at least being able to kind of hold both of those maps in mind when you have a child is that what we don't want for our children is for them to be kind of going from one map and then crossing over the bridge and going on to this completely separate map where they have these, you know, really kind of different ways of relating with both parents. Not that that in itself is problematic, but that if that's not recognised, then what can end up happening is that the child themselves feels quite split between these two very different ways of relating. So if as parents or co-parents we can come together so that we can find that common ground and walk those common paths, it just means our child has a lot less work to do to be able to find their own pathway through those relationships.
Just to be super positive about that analogy, having children encourages us to really look at the other person's map, possibly for the first time. You know, we've been happy on this bridge of romance or whatever, and whatever is shared, and actually this might be the first time we're like, ooh, that's you. This is all you, and this, wait, hang on, this is me then. You know, there's something beautiful in that, right?
There is, if you're able to and prepared to have those conversations in a sort of open-hearted and curious way. I mean, the troll analogy is that because often we end up in these conversations where it is essentially like my map's better than yours and let's just do it my way. And we find it hard to communicate and find common ground. But if we can imagine that there's a troll under the bridge that's kind of stopping us from reaching each other, then the troll becomes the shared problem or the thing that we can kind of work on together, rather than getting stuck in this kind of loggerhead of actually mine's better than yours or we should do it my way and not your way. It then becomes something that we kind of can tackle together as a couple.
I think that's a really useful kind of way of allowing parents to come together by kind of externalizing something in the kind of concept of the troll. It creates the possibility of collaboration that sometimes doesn't feel there, because I think sometimes when you have those moments as a parent with your co-parent where you notice the differences in the map that you hadn't before, it can feel like a betrayal and a threat in a really deep, visceral way. It doesn't just feel like a difference. And that that creates such a big, profound feeling of lack of safety, danger. So the idea of conceding anything or meeting can feel too high risk. Whereas if you put kind of some of that fear and menace in something external, you're able to find a kind of more shared place and find those areas of safety.
Which is very hard to do, right, when you're sleep deprived and, you know, you're arguing about who's going to take the bins out, or, you know, why did that thing that was supposed to happen yesterday not get done? Because that's the stuff that we don't really think about. And it's really not romantic and it's really not sexy to talk about the kind of the laborious side of being a parent and running a household together and having a family. And I think because it's a bit boring and a bit mundane, you know, we don't talk about it in these kind of open and vulnerable ways. And then it does become a kind of, you know, an attack. It comes out in a much more sort of fighty flighty way. And often, you know, kind of what's underneath that are really important kind of messages and feelings about what sort of person we're supposed to be as a parent, what sort of person that we're supposed to be as a woman or as a man. All of that gets wrapped up in this, but it comes out as a, you know, you didn't do that thing, rather than I'm actually feeling really overlooked or I'm feeling undervalued, which is usually what it's really about.
I mean, just to push back on that a little bit, like we do find the time for the admin meeting, right? You know, you're going to do this week, I'm going to do that. And actually, maybe it's about using that time to go a little bit deeper. And that actually can be romantic. Or am I really annoying everyone with my positivity today?
No, I quite like that. There's something really sweet in that. I like it.
Because it's kind of like, I don't know, if you take a business, it's like, right, we're going to have the admin meetings, but we're not going to discuss what the business actually does.
Yeah.
It's like we haven't gone to that like deeper bit of, well, what are we selling? You know, like. Yeah, we're just going to say who's working on what day without agreeing what our business does.
Yeah.
So
So
it's
what are we
maybe
actually
just
doing
about,
here? What's the actual point of all of this? I'm just impressed that you're having an admin meeting.
I was going to raise that as well, because when you said we do have the time for those, I was
Do
thinking,
we?
that,
right.
I don't see, like, I know that you guys do, but I think that typically they're like, drive-by
Mm,
interactions of, can you do that? Or why didn't you do that? And then someone's out, someone's off. And actually, there often isn't those discussions. And there's a lot of assumptions,
Yes. And
either about the other
expectations.
person or ourselves, and expectations which are often not voiced and communicated. And they're kind of flung at one another as you sort of pass at speed, rather than actually having the conversation. So kudos to you guys for making the time for those
yeah,
admins or finding a
maybe
way to do
maybe
that.
I'm just living in a world where my youngest child is now 11, and if you'd spoken to me 5 years ago, it would have been like, admin meeting. Are you mental? Yeah. So it's possibly just that.
Yeah, there's also a lot of resistance to admin meetings in my experience. I don't know about you, Ditta, is that, that kind of sense of, oh, we're going to really sit down and get into this kind of mundane, everyday stuff. It's really boring. And I think there's a lot of resistance for couples that has to become part of their life. But like you said, Alex, that's what we do in every other sphere of our lives, right? If we're running a business or if we're, doing a project, there would be some sort of overarching vision of kind of who's doing what. But often because there are so many unspoken, unconscious expectations in family life, that kind of very basic need often doesn't get met.
There's often this feeling of when you go into parenthood, like this is a thing that we're doing together. And it's this effusion of our love in some capacity. And then suddenly you have this triangulation of what was this two-person relationship with two people kind of facing each other. And that has a really big impact in a lot of ways that isn't always noticed. And in I think a lot of resentment about all sorts of things can come from this seismic shift in the dynamic. Including what you mentioned at the beginning, Alex, about these kind of parenting differences. I've often seen that the typically father or non-primary parent feeling that the mum is too permissive or too responsive is often also to do with that sudden triangulation and feeling excluded or abandoned. And so there's that is in there as well.
And also, I think a kind of, what I see with men, it's a kind of, I want to do it this way. Again, when talking about strategy there, not values, right? Which I think is a brilliant thing to pull apart. But strategy wise, I want to do it this way. You're not listening to me. I feel ignored. I'm going to turn away. Whereas actually, if we went underneath, as you said at the beginning, we could find something that works
And it's
for
more
both of us.
about the relationship, and then that partner potentially feeling quite sidelined or abandoned. And we haven't talked about how gender comes into this and gender roles and gender norms. And, they're often that dynamic that gets set up where, let's say in a heterosexual relationship, that the mum might be more permissive, the dad might be a bit more authoritarian. That's often a really direct repetition of a pattern that they experienced growing up. If we're thinking about what different generations were like, often for women, who've kind of potentially thought a lot about the kind of mothering that they want to do, the kind of mother that they want to be, there's a real emphasis and a very important part of their role and identity in repairing some of that damage that they feel perhaps was done to them. And then for men, if they haven't had done that same thinking or don't have that same self-awareness, there can often be this clash where one partner is just repeating the pattern, the other partner is really trying to shift it. It often becomes very gendered for various different reasons, ton of different reasons, and that in itself can cause such conflict because, for the mother who then has this kind of really, kind of present sense of, like you used that word, Ditta, before, the kind of lack of safety, that actually that it feels like there's such a lot at stake here because maybe I don't want this child to feel like I felt. And then if they're witnessing their partner, the dad, kind of repeating that pattern, it can become, really hostile. The partner becomes almost like an enemy. And I think then the values do become quite different, because if for that father, there is something there about, but this is what good parenting is. Like, this is what I was taught parenting was all about. Like, why has she got such a problem with this? I'm okay. So why do we have to change anything? And then if for the mum, there is this sense of, actually, I wasn't okay, or I'm not okay. And if we repeat this pattern, then I feel like it's going to be disastrous. It's essentially like these two children are talking to each other while also trying to parent another child. And that can become a really, highly emotional experience, where it becomes very hard to connect again. And I think that that's often, that we're having those conversations maybe a bit more in the past year or two, but for the kind of majority of my career, certainly, that kind of sense of, in heteronormative relationships particularly, the partners being on quite different pages has been quite a prevalent part of my experience as a clinician. And the bit that we don't talk about as parents is often the fear that's underneath that, right? So in the example that I just used, the fear for the mum might be, well, I don't want my child to feel harmed in the way that I did. The fear for the dad might be, but I don't want my child to be entitled, or I don't want them to be weak or vulnerable. So, and then, they become, really contradictory and conflicting goals that, then get played out often, in front of the child and in these kind of daily rows.
Yeah.
I just want to ask both of you that, are we saying, I feel like at the root of what you're saying there is that women find it easier to be like, I'm not okay, and think about, and here's why, and maybe here's what wasn't, we're not talking about blame, but maybe here's what I was missing. Whereas men, we're sort of programmed to be like, I'm all right. So obviously the way it was done for me was the right one.
Yes. I mean, yeah, that is what the research shows, and that's certainly what clinical experience shows, is the sense that girls and women are often socialized to be able to talk about their emotions and also care and nurture others. And for boys and men, that's not seen as being kind of part of the masculine identity, and is often actually, kind of ridiculed, or, boys who are kind of seen as being more vulnerable or sensitive will often be bullied for that still. So it becomes really hard for boys and men to talk about their vulnerabilities. And we see that absolutely in the kind of mental health stats in terms of who seeks support.
Not just to talk about, but to feel. I think that comes up very much in the second half of your book. It's not just that I don't want to share my feelings. It's that
it's that I've packed them away and I'm not even going to access them. Yeah.
And I think that that's a really big thing. I think that, and as Zara points out, it's it shows up in research and in kind of clinical experience, that there is more of a kind of historical culture of women not just talking about their feelings, but thinking about their feelings. And men have been much more to think like that. It's much more of a, didn't do me any harm, as you mentioned, Alex. And often I think it is about, you get men who know there's something not feeling right, but just not knowing how to access that or what it is. It's like, that there's no, using your map analogy, there's no internal map. How to get to the root of that, how to think about things. And often it's the same thing with parents and their young children. We don't know how to think about the child's experience. And I think that's something that really I find in my work shows up as a big difference, is that men don't have the internal toolkit to unpack their own emotions and to reflect on them.
The Brené Brown quote you give in the book about empathy, right, is that I've got to feel this thing in myself in order to be able to find it in you. So if we're blocked from feeling that in ourselves in the first place, we lose out on this massive part of the toolkit.
And I think that, you know, for a lot of men who becoming a parent can be such an overwhelming experience. There is so much emotion. Like you feel your own emotion in becoming a dad, and then you're having to absorb a lot of emotion from your baby, then toddler, then child. And actually, you know, for both men and women, if you feel like it's hard to access your own emotions, then just being hit with this kind of onslaught of emotion can feel really challenging. And what can often happen, particularly for dads, is that sense of, well, this is just too much for me, so I need to avoid it in some way. And where a kind of another layer comes in is that often boys and men are taught that the only emotions that are acceptable for them are either happiness or anger. So if as a man, as a dad, you're feeling something really strongly and the only way that it can come out of your body is through anger, then of course what ends up happening is that you push away your partner or your children. And then people can end up feeling increasingly isolated. And we see that, you know, in the kind of mental health statistics for men. It's a concern, but there's a real stalemate, I think, going on at the moment for certainly in my work in terms of for parents, where, you know, there's a kind of lack of common understanding as to what's going on for the other partner, and a lot of anger and resentment that gets played out in day-to-day family life.
I think that's a huge thing. I think something that I see quite a lot is the way that sadness, hurt, loss can often come out as anger in men, and rage can often come out as sadness in women.
Hmm.
Also, while you're parenting, you don't necessarily have time to go, actually, maybe I'm not angry, maybe I'm really sad, or maybe I'm not sad, I'm full of rage.
And often it's so
Mm.
similar, right? The roots of those feelings are so similar. It's like, do you love me? Do you still care about me? Are you noticing all this work that I'm doing for our family? Like, if you kind of just listen to the message underneath all of that, often both parties are saying the same thing, but just saying them in very, very different ways.
Mm.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Actually, because the whole time we've been talking about this, which is such fertile ground. I've been thinking about defensiveness. Are are men more defensive than women? You know, when you first said, I think a while ago, you were giving an example. You know, I feel overwhelmed. I, I hear criticism if you're saying that to
Mm,
me. I hear you're doing something wrong, you're bad, and then I get defensive,
mm,
and but then there's something actually that's underneath that, which is, do you love me? Are you still into this?
yes,
Can you see it at all? Can you see what I'm doing? Can you that isn't criticism.
yeah. Or often
It's a it's a
it's also overwhelm, right? It's like, please don't ask me to do any more than I'm already doing. You know, that kind of, oh, if you're overwhelmed, what does that mean about what I'm doing? Is it not enough? And I think that can often come up. Am I not enough? So, you know, that what I'm doing in my role. And for men, I think there's often this kind of layer of, but I'm doing so much more than my dad did. Like, how is this still
right,
not
yeah.
enough? Or I'm doing so much. This so often comes up in conversations in couples, but I'm doing so much more than my friends or my brother-in-law, or, you know, so how is this still not enough? And the parameters for parenting are so different from what they were when we were children, and they're changing all the time, partly because again our roles have changed. So if both parents are working, then obviously there's much more need for equity in the home. We know again from all the stats that women still are doing the vast majority of household labour and childcare, so there is a resentment there if kind of two people have grown up side by side kind of on the same trajectory, and then all of a sudden they become parents and one of them is just ostensibly doing much more labour and is taking the hit for that in terms of their physical and emotional well-being. Of course there's going
Yeah.
to be resentment there. But, you know, we're just having those conversations now. Like, it's only recently that we're actually being able to start to address, well, you know, what was the consequence of us being raised in the same way up until this point, and how does that impact when we become parents? And those are conversations that aren't going to be solved this generation, right? They're
Yeah.
conversations that, you know, we're going to be figuring this out for a really long time. I think when you were saying there, Alex, that for men, maybe what comes up is that sense of defensiveness. I think for women, often what they can turn to is the more sort of people pleasing, actually maybe. So if a man's kind of hearing, maybe I'm not doing enough, maybe I'm feeling criticized, I think a woman can also feel maybe I'm not doing enough, but will then kind of end up in a, what more should I be doing? And the list of sort of tasks for mothers has just grown and grown and grown and grown over the time that I've been working with mums, that kind of sense of what is expected of you. I mean, it's grown for both parents, right? For all parents and
Right,
caregivers.
but I think what's really interesting to come back to link that to the hang on, I'm doing like 3-4 times what my dad was doing. If you look at the overall expectations, my upward trajectory doesn't touch the sides, right? Doesn't matter that I'm doing 4 times as much because Eloise is doing 10 times as much.
Yes, exactly.
They're like, but we're both sat in this place where we're looking at the other side and being like, you must be slacking. Because
yes, how am I this
I'm doing so
overwhelmed?
much.
Like, how am I this overwhelmed? And then we can, again, that's the troll, right? That's the troll that comes in, because maybe it's not about the other partner not doing it. I mean, sometimes it is about the other partner not doing as much as they could be, but also the troll is social expectations and how, the sheer amount of tasks that are demanded of us every day by society has only increased in the past sort of 15-20 years. I mean, imagine what our own childhood experiences would have been like if our parents had smartphones, right? Like that, just the introduction of the smartphone into family life. Like, you're constantly accessible. You have something that can entertain you in the palm of your hand all the time that is taking away your attention. You can work 24/7 if you want to. Like, just that alone has really changed the face of what family life looks like and kind of how constant that demand on us can feel.
And even that distinction, that very recent distinction between parenting and being a parent.
Yeah.
That used to, you had children and you were a parent, whereas now it's a very active verb that includes a huge amount.
Parenting only becoming a verb in 1958. I thought that was fascinating.
One of the big things that kind of you both look at there is the kind of that resentment that comes up of like, if I'm so overwhelmed, it means you must be slacking. And I think we've kind of created this fallacy that there is a magic equilibrium. There's this magical place where if we split it right and we have the right chats, we're not going to feel so overwhelmed and drowning and resentment. Like, not sure that's real. I think it's an illusion. And if we keep clinging to the illusion of that, we're stuck in a place of resentment, because it's always going to mean that someone else isn't pulling their weight properly if we cling to the idea that if we had the balance right, it would be okay. And actually, I think there's something to be said for going, it is really overwhelming. It is really hard. We can work on it as best as we can, but also to have an honesty about that magical place where the balance is all perfect. It's not really feasible when there is so much expectation.
I think we sometimes get into a place where we're like, these, particularly from a woman's point of view, these are all the things I'm now expected to do. This is a burden that should be equally shared, rather than being like, let's pull these apart and try and not do a lot of them because they're unrealistic. They they cancel each, what's the word I'm trying to say? They're opposites. They don't sit together. A lot of them just don't, you can't do both those things.
Yeah,
so rather than trying to share that burden, let's bring it right back to kind of what are our values? What are the things we're going to care about?
Do we actually not want to do that in the first place? But I think then gender expectations does come back to it as well, because I think one of the things that can often get in the way of that is, like, let's say, for example, one of the things on that list is tidying the house, right? And what women will often say is, yeah, but it's all very well and good if I lower those standards, but my partner is not the one who's going to be judged if somebody comes in and the house is messy. So again, like, that's where social expectation comes in. That's where identity comes in terms of what does it mean to be a good woman versus what does it mean to be a good man, and what are the kind of things that are tied up in that even if we don't believe in them anymore, still will affect how we feel or how we think
Yeah,
other
because everyone else
people,
does. So
other people do.
yeah.
So and it becomes really complicated. And I think that's where it can be really hard to have those conversations if you're not aware of all of those different layers that come into it. Because, for a partner, let's say, for a partner who is kind of, both of them have agreed, maybe let's just not do, I don't know, let's not mop the kitchen floor as often as we do. That's one of those things that's causing us a lot of stress. But then if somebody then kind of comes in, sees it really messy, and a woman feels judged for that, it's very common that her partner will then go, oh, don't be silly, it's not a big deal. But that is something that might feel like a
Don't be
really big
silly.
deal. And so that kind of invalidation that can so often happen without anyone realizing it, or that's often not the intention. So I think there is something there
Mm.
about, how do we become curious about those things for each other? And that's where understanding each other's maps can be so helpful. Because actually those messages that we've received and been socialized into from really early years, we don't always know about that for the other partner. So if we're parenting together, being able to just be curious rather than dismiss it as kind of not important or not of value, but where is that idea coming from? Where does that message come from for you? Why is that important to you? And sometimes talking about it, naming it, unpacking it is enough to say, actually, maybe that's not important to me. Actually, maybe I'm not going to care about other people's judgments. Maybe that's something that we can kind of take on together. Or having said that out loud, actually, it is really important to me because, your mother's going to, give me a really hard time if she comes in and the floor's not mopped. So, how do we then resolve that together as a couple?
I think that was,
That feels universal. Sorry. Go on.
yeah, it's absolutely definitely the theme of in your book, and generally I think in your work, of the curiosity is, for me, so key. Just keeping that genuine curiosity about your own experience, your partner's experience, or your co-parent, whether you're together or not, and that open space for it, for listening. I think it's just so essential, because without that, there are all these invisible blocks that come in. And I really believe that is just so, so key. And it's nice to see that thread just coming through the whole book.
And I think it's often there for people who parent kind of outside of that heteronormative norm, so for same-sex couples, for people who are parenting, with friends or caregiving in a kind of, anything outside of that very narrow normative way of raising children. You have to have those conversations beforehand because you don't have the same assumptions and expectations and, that kind of pre-written story that you're just expected to follow. So it often means that those conversations, because they have to happen, means that there's much less room for misunderstanding and resentment. And, there is just that communication that's set up that these are things that we have to talk about. Whereas when you come from a background that's more heteronormative and you're raising children in that way as well, it can be very easy to fall into something that feels maybe more traditional or more automatic or more in line with societal expectations and norms, even if that's kind of not what you want to be doing.
That's a really good point.
I really don't want us to stop without talking about trauma. And I feel like maybe as a segue, one of the things, it's one of the expectations that's changed. It's one of the things that's changed along with screens is our awareness of small t trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Do we worry about traumatizing our children too much?
Oh, what a question. Do we worry about it too much? Well, I think...
Yes or no?
Bye. I don't know whether we worry about it too much. I think we've had awareness raised of the prevalence of childhood trauma in the last 15 years. There's been a huge growth in research. We understand things from a neuroscientific perspective now. We can actually see the impact of trauma on kind of early child development, and we understand much better now how that can impact on children as they grow up. So that's a scary thought, but it is also, there is kind of evidence for that, right? It's realistic. We understand that there are there are things that can happen to children that can traumatize them, that can have a long-term impact on their development into adulthood. So I think that it's valid that we understand that. And I think it's really important that we worry about it, actually. I think it's, something that knowing that is really helpful for society, right? That actually parenting and early child development, caregivers, nurture, all of that has a real world impact on humans. And the way that it's being discussed is perhaps not so helpful. So the rise in awareness has kind of come alongside this kind of bombardment of information. So if I think about kind of 15 years ago when these studies started to become kind of more in the mainstream news, like, brain scans on the front of the newspaper, they're presented in such a, it has to be like a scaremongery, hit the headlines kind of approach, that there's a lot of fear that's often attached to that information. I'm thinking about, there was a study from Bruce Parry who there's a study in kind of long-term, maltreatment and neglect, and how that can impact
The
on
brain
a
size.
toddler brain and the size of different lobes in the frontal lobe, and how the limbic system can be affected. And he himself has talked about how frustrating it is to see that scan being misused as a way of creating fear, and it's misrepresenting his research. So I think
It's used
that,
very clumsily.
yeah, it's used really clumsily. It's used to create fear in people. What we know is that when people are scared, they can't learn, they can't think about making change, they can't use that information in meaningful ways. So often what ends up happening is that we shut down, or we just get overwhelmed with anxiety. And I think that's kind of where we are at the moment. So I think knowing about small t trauma, knowing about the impact of parenting and caregiving on child development, that's really important. But the way that we then use that information is also really important. And I think in the last few years, there has just been a lot of anxiety created around it and not very much strategy. And what do we actually do with that knowledge? So what I see kind of increasingly in my sort of clinical practice is people coming with such a fear of making mistakes that they try and parent in this way that is perfect, that actually I'm going to do all the right things and I'm going to read all the books and I'm not going to mess up this child at all. And then, of course, that's unsustainable. And of course, in the end, you lose your temper or you burn out or you become exhausted, and you just sort of have to find a strategy that feels more sustainable because you're a human being and being a parent is a lifelong task. So I think in the end, people kind of get to this point where they do sort of settle into something that feels a bit messier, a bit more realistic, a bit more sustainable. But the anxiety is still there. Like, we are a generation of very anxious parents. And of course, that has an impact on how we feel about ourselves as parents, and also then how we relate to our children. Because if part of our parenting is I'm not going to mess this child up, then any behaviour from our child that is less than perfect is also really anxiety provoking. So it can cause a really tricky feedback loop.
Massively, that is, whether or not it's expressed explicitly, the child will feel it.
Yeah.
The child
Yeah.
feels that kind of the sort of parental reaction to their own emotions. And I think there's also something that I notice in terms of the small t trauma is the way we differentiate, like as a layperson, between, serious chronic trauma, acute or chronic trauma, and the ruptures, and I think, or mistakes. And I think that you did a post on this fairly recently on Instagram, kind of the idea that of sort of around the fear of this irreparable damage.
Yeah.
And how actually there's so much scope and time as well for repair. It's not just in those, first 1,001 days. There is really important, and actually it's also important for resilience and development, separation. And I think that's the bit that I really see that is not experienced perhaps as parents, that the ruptures, those mistakes, the bits where it isn't quite as you wanted it to be, or you get a bit cross, or you don't respond, that is not the same as trauma.
No.
And that there's an inevitability in how we respond and cope with those things is the really important bit. But I think there's so much panic that sometimes all of those little tiny normal things can be thought of as that, and then it sort of amplifies itself.
Yes, and often I think then people over apologize, right? Parents can
No.
sort of, rather than repair the rupture, there's a kind of apology for having messed up, that kind of sense of, I'm so sorry I wasn't a perfect parent to you. And I think that can often put a lot of responsibility on a child to then kind of soothe the parent's distress at having made a mistake. But also discord is just part of family life, right? How are we going to be in a family without having arguments sometimes? Like, we can annoy each other. That's just what we do as people, especially when we're living together day in, day out. There's going to be times that we don't get on. And isn't that a wonderful message to give to our children, and for them to give to us, and for them to, if they have siblings, to give to each other? Is that actually sometimes you really irritate me, and sometimes you're so frustrating, and I still love you, and we can kind of pass through that discord and disharmony and still come together as a family, because that's what we are.
Yeah, I think that's so hugely important, and there's something so powerful in that. And actually, Alex, I see this with you guys, the way in which that kind of, there's something about the kind of day-to-day discord that's allowed and okay. And actually, so I genuinely, I've seen it, there's the kind of, the irritability, the resolution, the kids are there, but in a really genuinely healthy, nourishing way that I think a lot of people are really scared of. And it's something that I really love seeing. And you can see the benefits of it, I think.
Yes. I also think there's something, isn't there, like your question, Alex, is around the impact of this knowledge of small t trauma. And there are so many conversations, like I'm thinking about social media, on podcasts, in the news, around, how do we kind of ensure that we raise these children in the kind of best possible way to prevent them from being traumatized, and that can often be translated as to prevent them from experiencing distress, full stop. But then we go through this massive collective trauma of the COVID pandemic, and that's kind of not really addressed at all. So while on the one hand, we're kind of talking in this very individual way of how do we make sure that our children aren't traumatized by our parenting or by what's going on within our family, on a societal level, actually, this generation of children experienced either, potentially directly through bereavement, grief, big losses, lots of children experienced, as well as poverty, increase in domestic violence, kind of all of those things were experienced by children through the pandemic, as well as the kind of more little t trauma of disconnection, huge life changes, huge transitions happening, adults around them also being stressed and distressed. And there's been no kind of work around repairing that for children, right? Maybe that's kind of starting.
And that's really made me think about the kind of cognitive dissonance they must all be experiencing around our kind of refusal to acknowledge the environmental crisis, or just kind of cracking on, whereas we know that what's happening is unsustainable, and we're not going to talk about that. La 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 la.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're just sort of carrying on with our sort of usual avoidant ways of dealing with things that we tend to have in the Western world. But those are the things that our children will turn around and say when they're adults. These were actually the things that traumatized me. These were actually the things that caused me distress. But actually, us having an argument in the morning, that was not really a big deal.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
So it's sweet. So it's not on us then.
We're the sort of, we're the conduit, right? Like that's what we are as parents. I mean, trauma is about the meaning that we create from things, right? It's not necessarily what happens to us. It's the meaning that we create around those events. So yes, maybe the climate crisis, and yes, the COVID pandemic might be things that our children later on talk about as having been traumatic, but we can also help them make meaning of it now in a way that can reduce that distress. So I'm sorry, it still is on us.
Yeah, okay. You've really brought that back there
Yeah.
to us again. There's a bit of your book where it's like, talk about what you want for your children. Brilliant. And then it's like, and if you've written happy, go back and change it and figure it out, really, because no one can be happy all the time. And I was like, oh, obviously, all right. Obviously, I've written happy. That's what everyone must write. But it's quite a ludicrous idea that, oh, I just want my children to be happy. No one can be happy all the time. So then without happy, it makes that question very difficult. And I just wonder if you've hit on something there with help them make sense of, help them find meaning in, something there that we can get behind.
It's sort of just being there, like walking on that path with them, isn't it? That as they kind of create their own map, which you are a very important part of helping them create. And then as they grow, you become less and less important. And if you're lucky, then you can kind of continue with them on their own journey. And in some ways, I kind of feel like that's, for me, kind of one of the most important goals that we can have as parents is just to stand alongside them and sort of let them be the people that they are. And that kind of takes away so much pressure from us in terms of, do we have to shape them? How do we kind of make them become these people that we really hope them to be? And rather than kind of all of that pressure, it's just, well, who are they? And we know that in children, and especially as our children get older, you can see that in them, right? That kind of sense of this little spark that they've always had in them since the day that they were born. And if we're sort of lucky enough to be with them throughout their childhood, often there is this kind of essence to children that doesn't really change. Even when they're like 70 years old, there's something in them that is so kind of inherently them. And I think that as a parent, it's a really wonderful honour to be able to kind of walk alongside them and kind of help to make sure that they hold on to that.
Well, that felt like a lovely note to end on. If you would like to find out more about Dr. Emma Svanberg, her website is drammasvanberg.com. The book we were discussing, which I really recommend, is called Parenting for Humans. Emma has another book called Why Birth Trauma Matters. She also, if you're interested in therapy or workshops, she also has something she runs called the Psychology Cooperative, and she is on Instagram as the Mumologist. The wonderful Benedicta Bywater Ditter. Her website is benedictabywater.com, and you can find her on Instagram as Benedicta Bywater. Please follow the podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can find us on Patreon as Be a Happier Parent, and hopefully I will see you all next week.